Hello, welcome. This is a Future of Good live journalism webinar with some excited participants. We're here to have a really important conversation. Last week in Davos at the World Economic Forum, our Prime Minister, Mark Carney, offered a speech that has really resonated with Canadians in pretty much every sector and really made us rethink our place in this moment and in this current inflection point. So I'm joined by three folks who are going to share a little bit about themselves, and then we're going to watch just a 30-second video to jog our memories of the best sections, and then we'll jump into the conversation. So we have Artie Freeman, who is here. She is the CEO and president of the Definity Insurance Foundation. We have Graham Singh, who is the CEO of Relevin, and we have Matt Hatfield, who's the executive director of Open Media. So Artie, can you just tell us a little bit about your work?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Anuk, and hi, Matt and Graham. So Definity Foundation, if you don't know us, we support communities across Canada in pursuing climate, health, and socioeconomic justice. And we've got a real focus on equity, supporting solutions that really address systemic barriers, especially those faced by Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay, over to you, Graham.
Thanks, Anuk. Graham, based in Montreal. Our focus at Relevin is the future of faith-based property. And we work with communities of faith and government and foundations to try to figure out solutions that are going to create a much greater social impact as we go forward in Canada's amazing future. There we go.
Over to you, Matt.
Hi there, folks. I'm Matt Hatfield. I'm Executive Director of Open Media, and we're Canada's largest grassroots digital rights community. We bring together about 230,000 people here in this country to fight for a better internet, for freedom of expression, privacy online, and for protecting democracy.
Fantastic. Nikia, can you cue up that video for us?
It seems that every day we're reminded of great power rivalry, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. And this aphorism of Thucydides is presented as inevitable, as the natural logic of international relations reasserting itself. And faced with this logic, there is a strong tendency for countries to go along to get along, to accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety. Well, it won't. So what are our options?
Thank you. Yeah, it's nice to see that. So when I saw the reactions to this speech online, especially on LinkedIn, but in a lot of different places, there were some real thought pieces and people really taking this as a call to action and a desire to rethink their own spaces and their own fields. And I knew that we had to have a conversation about what that means in social impact work. So my first question is just sort of your initial reactions. How did this hit you and why? So I'll send it over to you first, Artie.
Great. Thanks, Anuk. First of all, it was brilliant. And I'll tell you, its brilliance was in its honesty. So, the Prime Minister's use of analogy and use of historical lessons, Havel, Thucydides, it shifted the frame from it moved from technological economic stability questions to questions of legitimacy, power, and lived reality. So he did three things well in my mind. One, he recognized the moment. He named it plainly, that the old assumptions are not working anymore. He validated our experience. So, when you hear a leader holding up the mirror, it validates what people are experiencing in our own lives every day. And then he placed responsibility on us to question whether the systems we're working within are actually fit for the world we currently live in. And so for me, I just want to see the real value of this moment is it forces us to be honest about what's broken and to act. And that's what I loved about it.
Okay, we're going to get way deeper into that because I think that is really crucial in this moment. But next, I'll go to Matt for what were your first impressions?
Yeah, I think, like Artie said, pretty much every word of that speech was both true, clearly true, and very practical. And I think people around the world responded really positively to that. My background is in international relations. So, kind of the start of the field is the Melian dialogue that he quoted there. We're all raised on that through school. And I think the thing that he didn't dwell on is that after that dialogue, first the Melians are destroyed by Athens, and then Athens destroys themselves in the years that follow. Obviously, we're hoping that's not the situation that Canada and the US find ourselves in, but the consequences of things going wrong or of us repeating the mistakes of that era are very, very high. So I think we all appreciated the frankness from our government, but there's an enormous challenge facing all of us at the governmental level, but at every other level as well.
Thank you. Over to you, Graham.
Thanks, Anouk. I think we also all had the feeling that there's an adult in charge uh, of whatever's going on. And you drop your kids off at a party, and you end up asking, is there an adult in the house, or is this just all teenagers here? And the sense that there's an adult in the room at Davos. I know many adults in the room, and I'm not calling anybody not out. You understand where I'm going here. And I'll come back to this in a minute, but hearing Prime Minister Carney's voice speaking in that way had a very important presence for the world. And we've heard that, haven't we? I mean, there's no Canadian that hasn't had a note from somebody from somewhere else in the world saying, "Hey, your prime minister, this is great. Thank you very much." But that, first of all, was there. The effect of that then was, for those of us looking, for instance, at the social sector here in Canada, we're also able to say, as you would do in a well-functioning team, you'd be able to say that one team member would say, "Listen, I've got this. I'm working on this area. Trust me. Now, you guys over there, you need to keep going on this other area that you're working on." And I think for those of us domestically in the social sector in Canada, we need to think, pray, work hard on what's going on internationally and the impact of that. I think we can also say there are some really capable, bright people in leadership in this country that are dealing with those issues, which also allows us emotionally to say, I
Mhm.
can't solve all these problems, but I can deal with homelessness in Calgary, for instance, or whatever it is that people are working on. And I think that's the other effect of it, is it releases us to say, because we trust what's going on there, we can actually focus on some of the things that we are uniquely called to within Canada.
Absolutely. Um, so building on some of those points, you all, spoke about, having honesty, having things that are clearly true said out loud, is incredibly powerful. It's a bit funny that we're in this moment where that is so shocking. And this idea of having someone in charge and someone that we can trust. So, as we talk about, this speech was really about a rules-based international order, so the way that different countries interact together. But how do you see this applying into cause-based spaces in Canada, whether that be philanthropy, whether that be community building work, whether that be interactions between charities? What are some of the essential truths that we need to be surfacing? So, Graham, you're nodding, so I'm going to pass it over to you.
Well, the poster in the window that the prime minister referred to from Václav Havel, right? It said,
Yeah.
"Workers of the world unite." What is the sign in the window that we have as the social sector, right? What
Mm.
is it that we're telling everybody works? Something like, charity can help and solve the problem, or the social sector is working together for the good, and it's so well coordinated that we will find solutions for most things. I don't know exactly how. I haven't worked out exactly what the poster is there, but what I think the prime minister gave us the opportunity in the language, the text, which, I mean, this is going to become, it's pretty fun. You study history, and you study famous, important, epoch marking speeches. This is one of those speeches, right? I mean, here, thank you, Anouk, for, and Everyday Future Good for making this opportunity possible, because we will be telling our children about this speech. This is a famous global speech. I have a degree from the London School of Economics in international history. I am a historian. I was the fourth person in the world to study the CIA and British intelligence documents around what happened in Guyana, which is my father's country. So, if you geek out on that side, this is an important speech, right? It becomes a text that we refer to. And we're already starting to do that now. I think if we're honest, there's a story we haven't been honest about within the social sector. And I'll defer to my other speakers here, but basically, the basic idea, I think, is that, listen, people work hard, they buy and sell things. And ultimately, we've decided that we're going to tax them, whether they have income or they sell a business, they're going to pay income tax or capital gains tax. And that money's going to go to government or philanthropy. And out of government or philanthropy, we're going to solve all the things that you buying and selling the things that you do doesn't automatically solve. We're going to make market corrections. The story is that that money is actually talking to each other in a very wonderful way. But dialing all the way ahead to, hey, what doesn't work when you're buying and selling things? Well, the homeless guy on the street in Winnipeg who comes from somewhere far up north, who's dealing with substance abuse, mental health challenges. The nonprofit who goes and helps that guy, which is enormously difficult. It's not just about housing, it's about really staying with that person all the way. That nonprofit does not perceive that the system is working. They perceive that they are constantly having to go back and find funding and deal with this and losing staff because none of them were paid the right way. And actually, that part of it is broken. And you step back and you think, but we taxed people and told them we were going to fix these things either through philanthropy or the government. And frankly, some parts of philanthropy are hoarding money, not Artie. That's why we can have her on this conversation. And she's an amazing, Divinity Foundation's an amazing example of the way they came upon that money, what they're doing with it. But there is hoarding of philanthropic money. And there is government inefficiency. And so to me, that story, from the person on the street needing help to the nonprofit, to the charity, to the government, that story is not working. It ain't working with the social finance fund has done a lot or tried to do a lot, but there's pieces of this that were like, we want to be cheerleaders. This is the best. And we also have to take down that sign from the window because there's parts of it that aren't working. So I think Prime Minister gave us that opportunity.
Yeah, Graham, if I could, because there's a huge fiction in what you just said. And that is that we can continue aligning and performing as if systems are working when they're failing. And we do that just so that we can stay comfortable and keep the lights on. And for years, nonprofits, I gotta be honest, we've been absorbing failure so that systems can look functional on the outside, but it's no longer sustainable. Example, food banks, essential and urgent, but it was never meant to be the backbone of our food system. Like when emergency response becomes permanent infrastructure, it tells us something. Like that something isn't working, right? We also see it. You mentioned, social finance. We see it in the innovative funds created, and this is your work over the last decade to ensure capital is flowing, to ensure it addresses the needs our communities have, to ensure that Black and Indigenous peoples have access to loans and equities. The initiatives matter. We support a lot of them, and they're doing important work. But guess what? The reality is these are workarounds. They exist because our financial system as designed is not working for everyone. And when workarounds, same analogy, become permanent, it is a signal that the system itself needs to be redesigned. And so that fiction, is what we're buying into. And the result is nonprofits now are absorbing that volatility so that everything else appears stable. And guess what? That doesn't build resilience, it produces exhaustion. So, one of the most powerful things and the hardest thing we can do is stop pretending, stop helping broken systems look functional. Name the problem, sure, have a stopgap, but more importantly, I think we need to create space to imagine and test new systems. I can't stress that enough. I feel like a broken record.
Artie, I'm going to call you right after this seminar. I'm going to be like, Artie, you nailed that. So rather than just tell you afterwards, I'm just tell you right now. That was really well said.
Yeah, definitely agree. Matt, please jump in here.
Yeah, I think the pleasant fiction that might die through this moment is the idea that in Canada, government can fill all the gaps. Our government, our federal government, is telling us very clearly through their budgeting that they are going to do less, that they have less to spend, and that for whatever good and bad reasons, they're focused on the economy and defense. And so a lot of the causes that we care about in Canada that we've relied on governments to fund, I don't think that government funding is going to be there. We're seeing a 15% staff decrease across government on average. I think that's a start. I suspect there's going to be further cuts in the years ahead. And Canadians are a little bit in a mindset where we just assume our tax dollars are going to go far enough. We're not particularly high in terms of philanthropic giving. And so I think for causes that we do care about, that we were hoping government had, it is going to be a really important time to reconnect with the nonprofits that are doing this work. It would be great if government were able to fill these gaps, but I think the message we're getting from the Carney government is they don't see themselves able to do so. And so it's going to be a lot of gaps to fill.
And Matt, can I just probe you on that? Because I'm thinking, that's where we need new kinds of partnerships, right? New kinds of leveraging each other's capital.
Yeah, to be sure. I mean, I think corporate giving is a really important area, and corporate partnerships. I think really, though, I'm also looking for Canadians who are secure enough to give, to make sure that they're mindful here. Obviously, some of us are in a lot of economic distress right now, and we're not looking to those folk. But for folk who've paid down their mortgage, have a home, are doing okay, and value the Canada we've had previously, I think we need to make sure some version of that Canada survives into the future, because it's not going to come from government funding, I don't think.
So Matt, imagine Canada would jump in and say Canada's social sector is 200 billion of our GDP per year. We could look at somewhere around 200 billion sitting in long-term invested assets of the philanthropic sector in Canada. I could tell you there are 30,000 of Canada's 86,000 charities. 27,000 of them are religious. Of those, 17,000 have some kind of property. 12,000 is a place of worship. So we could map this out, right, and say there's a lot of money flowing.
Mm.
One of the things I would say to the response, I think it's absolutely right what you just said, Matt. And I think, in our conversations with various levels of government, we're trying to engage that with, okay, within there, we've got land wealth. What if we put in the land wealth of the social sector and began to look at how we could restructure that? The largest single category of land wealth in the social sector is religious property, right? It is pretty easy to make sense around that. If you looked at that and said, of the 200 billion of the social sector that's spent every year, jobs, all kinds of jobs. First of all, it's a big sector. And I think Imagine Canada does a lot to try to say that. I just don't think the federal government really gets it right now, the real value of the social sector. What do we give? What do we get? I think we could do better with that. And I think we're quite fractured in our messaging. That's one point on us, right? That's something that we really need to attend to. But in terms of direct expenditure, it's pretty easy. We're spending most of our money on staff, and that's the right thing to be doing so that we can deliver programs. The next biggest single category is actually money we're spending on our premises. And throughout the pandemic, the social sector has realized we need a lot less physical space, bricks and mortar space, square footage than we thought we did. So we don't need none of that space, but we need a lot less, and we need it in different locations. So the idea of restructuring property, that's certainly where we're working. That is what we have proposed to the Carney government. I mean, this is all pretty much in the public domain in our proposal on a federal guarantee for a group of loans to help the nonprofit sector restructure its property holdings. It is an example of where it could be done for as little as zero budget dollars. This could be done entirely with off balance sheet guarantee from the federal government. And that's something, it's a kind of thing. I know that's our ideas, we're working on it. Lots of folks here on the call and are involved, but I think the invitation is to think along those lines, isn't it?
And to think bigger. I think we really need to think in a bigger, more imaginative way. We've talked a lot about, sort of harm reduction and making things 5% less bad. I think that's important. Harm reduction is a very crucial part of nonprofit work. But what does it take to truly imagine solving problems? Solving housing insecurity, food insecurity, gender-based violence. There are so many issues that are human-made and can be human solved and can be restructured. Okay, so I want to get into something that we were talking about, sort of, this idea of pleasant fictions. I think there's a lot of pleasant fictions, and I love your point, Artie, about who is nonprofits really assuming and absorbing so much insecurity and the impacts of that. So my question is around, I love this idea of like participation in rituals that we all know to be a lie. And I think we do this, in our personal lives, and it's sort of, going along to get along. And sometimes the ends justify the means. But the danger comes in when we perform as if these pleasant fictions were true. And this is something that we can take on in nonprofit spaces and in cause-based spaces. And so I just wondered, what are some of these pleasant fictions and some of these performances that we can drop?
I got a funny story that while
Okay.
Artie and Matt are thinking about that, I could drop in the funny stories. A friend of mine who worked in the pure corporate sector, he's a technology professional. He's a brown-skinned francophone person, and he made it to the top positions in a number of major Quebec companies. And the reason I mention the color of his skin is it's, Quebec is an interesting place in terms of racial diversity and cultural diversity. And anyways, he'd made it big. He's made it big as a technology professional. And all of a sudden, he was approached by a major component in the philanthropic sector, and he found himself all of a sudden in the nonprofit sector. And he called me one day. He's like, Graham, it's just killing me going from the for-profit sector to the nonprofit sector. He's like, at least in the for-profit sector, I know everybody's out to get me all the time. My competitors, my people in other departments, they're all trying to pull at me all the time. Some of them are trying to kill me all the time. In the nonprofit sector, though, you guys all tell each other that you love each other so much and you're for each other and you're cheering each other on. And then quietly you're like, this guy's doing things a totally wrong way. This is not good. They're not going the right way at all. And there's this undercutting in there. And I think, honestly, the for-profit sector has better fights than we do in the nonprofit sector. And it's actually dishonest when we don't say to somebody, hey, I love you. I think you're great. But what you just said doesn't make any sense at all. It doesn't add up. It's not going to give the solution you need. We're not that good at somebody's like, oh, that's very unkind. That person's not acting in solidarity or not. I think we need to be better at fighting, and we're not the best.
That is so interesting. That makes me. I actually really love to argue, so I would totally jump into this personally, but it terrifies me professionally to get into those spaces. What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, let me build on that. I mean, I think as a good Canadian, I also don't love conflict, but I think living in difference might be the thing to aim for, is just accepting we can have different perspectives on things, like profound fundamental philosophical differences. That doesn't make one of us good or bad or right or wrong. I think of any complex issue as a version of the elephant problem. I don't know if you've all heard this, but we're all holding a different part of the elephant. We can't see the whole elephant. And I'm like, oh, it's got a trunk. And you're like, no, it has this long tail and legs. And we're all right in some sense, but we're dealing with quite different things. And when I think about pleasant fictions that may go away in this period, I think one fiction is that we are in a fundamentally comparable situation to nonprofits in the US. I think we've all always known the environment is quite different on the funding side. But let's also acknowledge we have a certain privilege, which is that we live in some degree of a functional democracy today. We have a rule of law. We have an expectation that will continue in the foreseeable future. And it's not at all clear that's going to happen in the US. We all hope for the best. But there's an obvious decline that's making people a bit nuts down there and understandably terrifying them. That's a privilege we have. A privilege they have is that their funding environment is vastly larger, vastly different. Both many more funders and a much higher willingness to give. And I think part of that is because they are used to a government that can't fill the gaps, and we are not. So maybe we'll be becoming more similar to that over time. I hope not. But just acknowledging the reality of that difference, I think, is something.
And look, I'll weigh in on the philanthropy, in terms of what we need to think about is, because the fiction shows up also in how we fund as a sector. We act as if short-term project-based funding is enough for long-term systemic problems, right? We fund as though the world is calm, when the reality is there's constant disruption and complexity. And so I think I think where philanthropy's unique role is we can stabilize organizations while funding imagination, holding early risk, and convening across power. And so, yeah, for me, I think it's really to think about, if we're saying we need to, that people need to reimagine the systems, are we willing to fund the stabilization so they can keep doing what they're doing, but also the room to reimagine what's next?
Hmm.
Can I hot
Yeah.
pursuit to that real fast?
Yeah, please.
So we work in digital tools, and a thing I see just absolutely constantly with apps is someone funds a really cool app, great idea, fills a real gap, and it's going to work for 6 months. And the reason is that the funding was project based. It was $30,000 to build the app, and that is not how apps work. And so, as a funder, do you want to hear, I'm going to owe you $5,000 every year forever for this app? No, you don't want to hear that. And that is the only way it's actually going to accomplish its purpose. I think our expectations are very misaligned to the need for constant security updates, keeping it compatible with new devices, actually having a functional digital tool.
And such a great example, Anouk. I know we're going to go there, but that is a perfect example of living in values-based reality.
Mm.
Hmm.
Just
Yeah, jump
before
in.
you go into there, I think back to the idea of expectation. Um, and for those folks listening, and I see a lot of familiar faces, and quite a few people I have no idea who you are. I've never seen your name before. I'm so excited to meet you. It's so great to have so many people with us on this call. There are some wonderful leaders from the philanthropic community who are here with us today, and so nobody here would be surprised to know that Anouk has invited us to make sure we're getting into the spicy, harder issues here. So here's one of them. Okay, who is the greatest friend to the poor in North America with regards to credit card fees and interest rates? And you think, oh God, are we going to have to thank Donald Trump? I mean, it's awful to think what an awful situation, but actually by reducing credit card interest to 10%, he's done a lot. Who is going to stare down some of these endowments that are not moving at all and make sure that they are moving? I hate to say it. I hate it, but I'll say it. They've done more in the US in the last year to really wake up the foundation. Some of them have quadrupled their disbursement quota voluntarily because they see people coming for them. So that's the hard thing. And don't you understand how I've been very careful to say that. Let me come back over to Canada. What are the expectations on philanthropic foundations on how they invest? Zero. There's zero legislation. If charitable foundation can put all their money in Saudi Aramco, which is the most energy non-conscious energy company in the world, they make more profits than every other oil company put together. There's nothing stopping a charitable foundation putting all their money in Saudi Aramco stock and then giving the money away after that. We have no requirement. There's an invitation to program related investments. It's kind of tucked away, could be a bit clearer, but we could be much firmer with our charitable foundations in expecting them to. Second thing is, if we're taking down I didn't mean to show my window, but as I'm taking down the poster off the window here, folks, I'm not okay that charitable foundations, and we lead a charity, we're not an endowed foundation, like we're three charitable corporations. I'm not okay that charitable foundations, especially their granting committees and their investment boards, see it as optional to do what you just said, Artie. Like, today maybe we'll think about structural change, and if we like that idea, we'll fund it. To me, there's a societal expectation without the capital gain, without the various tax exemptions that charities benefit from, they would just be private trusts. They would pay tax, that's it. So it is society's gift to a philanthropic foundation that they exist in the way they do. And society could be much clearer about our expectations for them to do what you're saying. So RT, I'm taking what you're saying and just flipping it and saying, this shouldn't be a nice to have or an optional. It should be required.
And Graham, I just one last thing. I have to be fair. Philanthropy in its inception, Carnegie, Rockefeller, was designed for a calmer, more predictable world, right? And for simpler problems. The rules were built around discrete programs, linear solutions, not systems change. Today, the work takes longer. It happens, during constant disruption and requires like giving organizations both, like as I mentioned, the stability and the room to adapt and innovate. But many of those rules that govern funding, partnerships, and timelines were built on assumptions that do not hold true anymore. And that is what we want to illuminate. We cannot operate the same way. This is the why. You've spoken about the what needs to change, but this is why it needs to change. The assumptions are no longer true.
You know, it's interesting you say that. So this fall, I had the chance to go to the Rockefeller Foundation archives. And so that's in upstate New York, and they have all the records of letters between granting officers and grantees, you know, seeing Rockefeller's giant Rolodex that's like literally a barrel. And it is interesting because, first of all, back then things were very untransparent. So, you know, what is written down was done in triplicate, and it was, you know, written by a secretary at a desk. So any conversation between a grantee and the foundation was extremely private, and they were very candid in how they spoke. So anyways, lots of interesting things there. But one of the pieces that was really interesting is that the Rockefeller Foundation did a lot of core and structural funding for what eventually became the atom bomb. And they're the ones who gave, you know, like there's a letter saying we need $18,000 US to like pick up our uranium from the port, basically. Like, will you send this to us? And then the granting officer is making a decision about this and says, clearly in it, like, please don't tell me what this is for. But it is really
wow. And they had the guts to put that out in the museum. That's quite something.
Yeah, well, the
them.
curators actually put it out for us. And I think, you know, sometimes, and this is the great thing about archives, it's like it really unflattens history. History is absolutely fascinating. And then the little bit of it that you write in a book saying that like Rockefeller Foundation gave this much money, like what was demonstrated is that over time they were granting, they believed in these researchers, and they actually recruited some of the best researchers in the world to come and work on this, and then they funded it. And I think that like really thoughtful engagement in the system and that understanding that they were building towards something is absolutely crucial. And that's the kind of vision that is very hard to do in today's philanthropy, in my opinion.
Hey, Anouk, I know we're going to the next section, but just a quick sideshow, Bob, to you know, as if there's any kind of sense of criticism of the large American foundations, and you know, I know we got into that a little bit. I'll just say this: my father grew up in the Caribbean, in Guyana, in which was one of the poorest countries in the Caribbean in the world for a long time. It's now become an incredibly wealthy country due to oil wealth. But back when they had nothing, my father won one of 5 Ford Foundation scholarships to study medicine. And that's what got him out of, as he likes to say, it was that or planting rice. I think he's exaggerating a little bit, but it really is. I mean, that was an agrarian culture there. And my father went on to qualify as a neurologist and serve as a neurologist here in Canada for over 50 years. So, you know, look at the gift that gave and the gift back to Canada now. And, you know, so I just thank the Ford Foundation and other American foundations that are doing amazing things, and other Canadian foundations. So, yeah.
Yeah. Matt, did you want to jump in on that before we move on? Nope.
No, I think it's been well covered.
All right, great. So, you know, one of the things that Prime Minister Carney specifically mentioned was strategic autonomy. He spoke about variable geometry. And part of this was really about building coalitions that work. And I think, you know, to me, that was really relevant in my work because I was thinking about what are the coalitions we need to build to fix some of the problems that we have and ensure that what we're imagining can work. So how do you see that? What are some of the coalitions that we need to be building in Canada? I see some nodding. Graham, do you want to jump in, or Artie?
I'm happy to.
Artie, I defer to you.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay, great. So first, let's just make sure we're understanding this in the same way. So if we borrow the logic of variable geometry and apply it to our work, for me, it gives us permission to adapt how we work as conditions change. It means we don't have to move everything at once. We can work on urgent needs and long-term systems change all at the same time, right? And strategic autonomy for me is about having the capacity basically to act on those different efforts when conditions shift. So, I take food as an example. And again, given the recent announcement, I do want to talk about food because this is a really good example, right? It requires responding to immediates, like I mentioned, immediate pressures plus long-term resilience. That's one of the things we really need to tackle. In Canada, we saw this in the announcement, was it 2 days ago, where, Carney announced um, the approach to food, to addressing food insecurity, or to create food resiliency, and basically supporting urgent needs like food banks alongside have I was so impressed. It was alongside heavy investments in production, supply chain, infrastructure. And so those move at different speeds, right? And different levels, but they're addressing different parts of the same problem in parallel. Now, as community organizations, we could like piggyback on that. We could be like, oh, now we want to also move on local food systems so we don't have to rely on global supply chains. We want to think about how food is locally sourced, or how the infrastructure for community needs to work. And so then we're building these things all at the same time. You could take one system like food, and there's so much in there. But what it does, when different parts of the system can move and adapt and reconfigure as conditions change, so we can look at that as building resilience instead of one fragile model.
Mm.
And I think that's one of the coalitions we should be looking at.
Matt, you're nodding. Please jump in there.
Yeah, I think if you look at what Carney was talking about on his level, he was essentially telling us Canada is going to be making some deals with states we have real values-based problems with. We're going to be making trade deals with China, even though China is a serious human rights abuser. We're going to be making probably a new trade deal with India, even though the Canadian government says they have reason to believe that India has been involved in some pretty awful killings within Canada. And so, what does that mean at the nonprofit level? I had a disagreement recently with a peer who was being very critical of other nonprofits because these nonprofits were taking money from big tech. These were not nonprofits that worked in any way on big tech. They were like, I don't want to name who they were, but like doing local service provision, really like absolutely not related to that stuff. Our work, a lot of it is aimed at big tech. And so I get where my peer was coming from. I'm like, these companies are bad. I'm frustrated. No one should take money from them. We all have to decide where the line is for us as an organization and as a person. But I would encourage everyone to not let people not doing your fight set the line for you. I think part of Carney's message for us is we cannot afford to apply every standard of morality on every dollar that we get from every source in the world. We have to set the standards of morality that apply to our specific sector and work. So if a company is doing bad work that is directly connected to your values and what you're fighting for, think seriously about whether to take them or not. But I think remain open to unlikely partnerships, I would say.
Jumping onto that, Matt, I think we've got to prepare, and we could have some fun actually thinking of what are some of the things that we might find really awkward. What if we start seeing indigenous groups playing a role in defense expansion in the far north? We know we're doing a defense expansion in the far north. We know we have indigenous communities that are there. What if they actually start collaborating? Do we then say you shouldn't have done that, or do we say well done? You're actually going to keep both parties are going to keep each other in a good way, but that might make us feel a bit awkward. In our case, I can tell you an example. We work with a lot of heritage churches. In our brainstorming around this new world order, we said, gosh, the mining sector, they have a lot of money. Well, the mining sector, they took all these stones out of the ground like 150 years ago with horses. So that means the carbon footprint's measured in horse manure, not diesel. Like, this is the best carbon footprint story the mining sector has, is that they built these old heritage buildings. So how do I get the mining sector to pay to fix up the heritage building? We were starting, if that freaks anybody out, I think we have, whether or not what we do about that is another thing. But thinking down those lines, I think we need to do. The other comment I want to make is European integration, right? We've gone from the European coal and steel community right after the Second World War to where we are today. We've had Brexit, we have a common currency in Europe, and now here we are in Canada, with Team Canada is making a lot of new friendships in Europe, and we're talking about how similar Canada is to Europe. So it behooves us to learn more about what they're doing. The integration process in Europe from Second World War to now, which is a long time, 75 years, really had a process and guardrails between deep and wide. And you want everybody included, but you can't go that deep if you're going to include everybody. And I think in Canada's social sector, this variable geometry really, which is how deep, how wide can we go, would mean that we could say, I love you, I love your group, I love you personally, you're fantastic. We would love to partner with you on these following areas. On this area, we're going a different way, and here's why. And we would love for you to go this way with us as well. But can we find a way to be great and collaborate here, even though we're going a different way here? I think we could sharpen that language, and learning from look. Deep and wide didn't work, right? I mean, Brexit happened. Brexit was a major rupture. Deep and wide was not applied to diversity, equity, and inclusion, United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in the US, where we lost both of those centers of gravity. Were lost because we didn't realize the average person didn't buy into those things. They became firmly against them. And that created the political conditions for the current American administration. So we could be thinking about those tensions a bit more intelligently. And we've got the smarts. Holy smokes, the social sector in Canada, very, very bright people. If we put our minds to this, we've got it.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Artie.
Yeah, I've been thinking about what was both said by Matt and Graham, and look, I agree. We definitely need to build different kinds of coalitions. We need to be working in tandem, but I think there's a risk here. We have come and we've seen how one side of the pendulum was about a cancel society. You just cancel anybody. They don't think like you. We cancel you. We don't want to talk to you. We don't work with you. You can't even talk to anyone. Like, you'll be crucified if you do that. Pardon the pun. But for me, it's really about, we've come from that kind of society. And now if we're going to move to like, we're gonna include everyone, or we're going to accept everyone even when the values are different. And this isn't what you're saying, but I'm imagining a future where that is the case. We're just working with everybody now. I think we have to go back to first principles, right? Like, and I think for me, that's where values really come in. So you may not be aligned, you may not think the same way, you may do things very differently. One, and we'll take the example of countries. One nation might be treating people in a different way, one might be treating a different way, but in this shared outcome, we're aligned on values. And it's finding that commonality that is strongly aligned with your beliefs and values, because the moment we stray away from that, that is where things start falling apart. That's where we're going to start seeing threads unraveling, right? And that is exactly what got us to the place we're in right now.
Yeah, and that comes back to this, values-based pragmatism. And also, there's a book, Collaborating with the Enemy, which really dives into this. And there's a lot of conversation in there about, finding the portions of something that you can work on and not judging the entire package. I wanted to bring just one other aspect to this before we move on. We spoke about, companies and for-profit organizations and large countries that have ethical practices that we might not be in line with. But I think there's also a space here where we need to demand more from highly stable organizations that have core funding. They are the ones who should be speaking out and should be carrying a heavy part of the lift. So whether, that stability comes from funding or it comes from structural stability, I think that is necessary. And then also just speaking to power, so much of the social impact sector has structural instability. And that structural instability creates all of the downstream issues that we're seeing, where that an unstable organization cannot speak out, it cannot be an effective part of a coalition, it cannot take the time to imagine. And I think that's, you know, like we really need to rally around that in some ways. Okay, so we are in our last 10 minutes or so. We'll be wrapping up relatively soon. But Graham, I wanted, you pointed out your book. You've got it there, Mark Carney, Values. I saw you wrote on LinkedIn that you felt that like this speech was just like, you know, basically an epilogue to the book. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Because I find it really fascinating that, first of all, you know, this speech was not written by a speechwriter from accounts, and is also part of a larger about, you know, sort of an epilogue to this approach.
Yeah, so the book, I enjoyed reading the book. I enjoyed much more listening to the audiobook, and the audiobook is actually dictated by Prime Minister Carney. And I think for those who, let's be a bit personal here, there are some people for whom just listening to the news or listening to engagement or conversations, and I hope today's a good conversation for people to listen to and, you know, be encouraged. But there are some, let's be honest, the trauma of the past few years, of all of the different chapters of the past few years, has been deep. And trauma gets engaged, and healing can come to trauma from a lot of different ways. And in my own journey last year, I had a period of sabbatical last year, and actually one of the most impactful books that I engaged in was called "The Body Keeps the Score" by Van der Kolk, one of the psychiatrists most known for the PTSD diagnosis. And as I read more about that, I thought, I think we're all, you know, trauma is something we need to spend, all of us need to spend more time. So, in terms of healing from trauma, I'm not an expert in it, but I would say there are some things that do tend to help. And just hearing the Prime Minister's voice is helpful. Listening to him actually read this book in his own voice is a good thing. I would recommend it. But it is deeper thinking. It is taking time. It's not sound bites. It's analysis of several waves of history. It really goes through certainly the last few hundred years, and it puts our current time into context, and it sets that leadership up. And it's important to note that at the time of the writing of the book, you know, perhaps Mark Carney had ambitions of going further to where he is today, but the road to getting there was, you know, c'est pas évident, was not very clear that he was going to get there, and he wrote that book as a thinker. So it's interesting to read it as a slightly less political than what you would expect from a political person book. It's deep, it goes through things. And when people heard him speaking at Davos, I think a lot of people thought, this is an intelligent conversation. I'm smart enough to listen to this. I'm willing to tune in. And the whole world tuned in at that level. And it was a different level. And frankly, if you took the text of that and you put it in the back of this book as an epilogue and you said, is this a different tone? The robots would, you know, any analysis would tell you it's the same tone, the same voice, the same thinking. And therefore, I think the value of consistency in there as well is something that makes that message sink in deeper.
So I just have a last question, you know, as we wrap up. So what does a principled and pragmatic approach look like going forward? So just a small, easy one-liner, obviously.
You just want a one-line answer?
I'm joking. No.
Please. That. Well, you know, let me start, because in the opinion piece I wrote recently, I hope you read it, in the Toronto Star, I tried to sum this up simply. We're using old maps for a new world, right? Crises are compounding faster than our systems are adapting, and investments without new thinking risks locking in outdated outcomes. So living, you know, it very pragmatically means holding two things at once: being honest about what's not working, and then being disciplined to build what fits. So this, you know, accepting that resilience requires design, not just repair. We can't keep retrofitting systems built for, you know, stability when volatility is now the norm. So for me, for us, I'll do this very simply. Like, I'll give you a real life example of things we're grappling with now. We're operating in an economic system that largely treats nature as something to extract, people as inputs, and that system is producing instability, inequality, and fragility. This is not a moral judgment, it's an observation of outcomes. I want to be clear in that. So for me, it's about making room to imagine, to build forward a different economy, one that actually works for people and planet. And we don't get there by pretending the current system is fine or wishing our way out of it. We get there by being honest about how power and incentives work today and holding on to our values without being naive. And so for me, it's about updating the map so we don't get lost. That's my one line.
Amazing. Matt, would you like to go next?
You know, none of us chose this world that we're entering. Prime Minister Carney didn't. We as nonprofits certainly would not choose it over what we thought was the alternative. I'm not even sure the Americans in power, if they understood the real nature of the world they were creating, would choose it either. I think this is a decline coming from ignorance and error. And it's nonetheless the world that we're in. And as Carney said, it's a rupture. It's going to be hard to, well, perhaps impossible to go back. And so I think we just, on a daily level and on a strategic level, we need to be asking ourselves, how do our values translate to this new situation? And what are the opportunities that might exist today that didn't exist before? Who do I need to talk to that I wouldn't have talked to in the old world? I don't think we should fool ourselves. We can turn this into a better situation than we had before, at least in the short term. But we can certainly be alive to opportunities for silver linings, for small things that are better, and try to build towards something better in the long term.
I would give the metaphor of disaster recovery. When we do disaster recovery, we actually have no homelessness. I don't know if you ever thought about that. When you have a flood, when we intervene with disaster recovery, nobody's homeless. Everybody gets rehoused. So we know how to do that. So why is it we have such a homelessness issue in our cities? One of the differences is urgency. So to me, principled pragmatic starts with urgency. It then goes to scope. What do we expect the social sector to accomplish? Let's all be agreed on that. What can it accomplish? What can it not? What is the scope? What are the outcomes that we need to see? And I mean, I think it's hilarious, frankly, that we have one of Canada's finest Indigenous owned and operated organizations, Raven Outcomes, that is absolutely leading the pack on an outcomes-based approach to this solution. So we say, why are we not listening to our First Nations, our Indigenous people about how to solve this? Well, there's Raven Outcomes that is leading exactly that way. So to me, an outcomes-focused approach that we need to learn from, then understanding the tools, then understanding the participants and realizing that some of those tools and participants need to be restructured. That's one that I think we are most uncomfortable with. How do we restructure the social sector? In any other environment, in government departments, in the corporate world, we would talk about merging, people would be acquiring, we'd be restructuring. That's a big one. I think it's one of the places we get stuck. And then understanding how do we operate in a new way and how do we measure? So to me, a disaster recovery model would absolutely look at those things and say, look, people have been flooded out. There's 500 people that are standing on the side of a road right now because there's a fire burning. How are we going to go? What tools do we need? I think we need to take up that level of urgency and do it as equals, not as government big daddy will come and tell us what to do. Philanthropy will tell us what to do because they've got the money. These people on the ground, handling poor people, they get the last say. And this is rubbish. This is completely ridiculous. We need to make sure we're together around a table the way we would be in a disaster recovery situation.
Well, that is a great closing line because one of the lines I loved in that speech was, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So, some thinking about where we want our role to be. So I want to thank our speakers today. Thank you, Artie. Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Matt. This was a phenomenal conversation, extremely timely. I want to thank everybody who participated and who is showing up in the chat. It just, the great thing about doing work like this is to see your community come out and to just know that we have each other's backs and we're here for each other. And this is the first step as we start speaking the truth out loud and start building this reality we want to see. So My plug for Future of Good, if you're not already a member, please go to our registration page, sign up. We have lots of great programming. Tomorrow we're doing the People's Practice Lab on how to build HR practices for thriving workplaces in the nonprofit sector. We have lots of great stuff coming up. So thank you, everyone.
Anouk, thank you so much. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Artie. Thanks, everybody in the chat. Sorry we didn't get a chance to write back to all of you. It was so nice to have that.